Hello, my name is John Hamel. I'm a licensed clinical social worker in private practice in the San Francisco Bay Area, California, with an expertise in the field of domestic violence, also known as intimate partner abuse. For the past 25 years, I've provided treatment services to perpetrators, victims, and their families. I am also the editor-in-chief of the peer-reviewed scholarly journal Partner Abuse, published quarterly by Springer Publishing, and I'm currently a visiting fellow at the University of Central Lancashire in the UK. The purpose of this short video is to provide you with a brief overview of the research upon which my online courses are based. Physical, emotional, and sexual abuse among married, cohabitating, and dating partners is a universal problem and occurs in same-sex as well as opposite-sex relationships. However, it was not until the 1980s that domestic violence began to be taken seriously in the United States. Due to the diligent efforts of victim advocates, laws were enacted that help keep victims safe and hold perpetrators accountable for their crimes. Additionally, a large network of shelters and other services has become available to victims and their families. No longer is domestic violence regarded simply as a family problem, something that happens behind closed doors. Note the preponderance of news stories, for example, about celebrities who've abused their partners, incidents that would have gotten little notice in the past. There is no question that things are much better today. However, while much progress has been made, the current system is not without its limitations. First, there are inherent flaws in the judicial system response to domestic violence. Vigorous arrest and prosecution policies have led to an increase in arrests, but as the number of arrests have increased, the percentage of successfully prosecuted cases has decreased. This is because so many cases involve lower-level types of violence, or there's been mutual abuse and a clear perpetrator cannot easily be identified. These cases usually have to be dropped. In a number of states like California, alternatives that would include deferred prosecution, which would otherwise mandate some form of treatment, are expressly prohibited. There's also evidence that when victims are denied a voice in the decision to prosecute, as they are in so-called mandatory arrest states, they're less likely to call the police in the future, putting them at risk for further victimization. And finally, men account for the vast majority of domestic violence arrests and prosecutions, even for misdemeanor crimes that do not involve serious injury to the victim. The percentage of female domestic violence perpetrators in the general population is actually very comparable to the percentage of male perpetrators. Arresting men, therefore, only addresses part of the problem. Additionally, there are flaws inherent in our current intervention efforts. Well-designed, sound outcome studies have found that the prevailing treatment model mandatory in most states, the same-sex psychoeducational group for perpetrators, typically based on sociological analyses of gender and patriarchy, has proven to be only minimally effective in reducing rates of recidivism. Recent social science research provides some important clues on how mental health professionals and other intervention providers might improve treatment efficacy. A growing body of empirical data indicates that the current intervention paradigm is based on a number of erroneous assumptions which need to be challenged as alternative interventions are proposed and put into place. Let's take a look at 4 of these assumptions. Assumption number 1. Domestic violence is the same as battering, a pattern of physical and emotional abuse that only gets worse over time. Assumption number 2. While women sometimes abuse men, they typically do so in self-defense or as a means of expressing anger. Assumption number 3. The primary cause of domestic violence is patriarchy, social structures and prevailing norms that allow and encourage men to dominate women and to use domestic violence as a means of maintaining male privilege. Assumption number 4. Mutual abuse is rare between intimate partners, and treatment approaches that use the couples or family format are inherently unsafe for victims. What is troubling about these assumptions is not simply that they're incorrect and that they drive treatment policies, but that they're rarely challenged, even by therapists who are trained in research methodology and are required by their respective professional organizations to provide appropriate treatment based on best practices. There are many reasons for this state of affairs, but a lack of reliable, accurate information is certainly an important one. Recognizing that most individuals working in the field of domestic violence, including most clinicians, do not have access to the most relevant peer-reviewed social science journals, and recognizing that more accessible information cannot always be trusted, I sought, in my capacity as editor-in-chief of the journal Partner Abuse, to make domestic violence research available in one easily accessible place. The resulting Partner Abuse State of Knowledge Project, or PASC, is a reliable research database on topics of most interest and relevance to scholars, clinicians, and policymakers, and provides a complete picture of domestic violence prevalence, risk factors, consequences, intervention, and policy. It is the most comprehensive domestic violence research project ever undertaken, involving 3 years of research and writing by more than 100 scholars from 20 universities and research centers. The PASC manuscripts collectively run a total of 2,657 pages. The manuscripts appeared in 5 special issues of the peer-reviewed journal Partner Abuse between 2012 and 2013. They are now free to the public, available online at www.domesticviolenceresearch.org. www.domesticviolenceresearch.org. The website contains all 17 complete manuscripts, including 1,700 summarized studies, organized in tables according to topic and subtopic in chronological order, as well as a 61-page summary of findings providing an overview of all 17 manuscripts and tables, as well as a shorter 12-page findings at a glance. So what do the PASC findings have to say about those 4 assumptions I mentioned earlier? Assumption number 1 is that domestic violence is the same as battering, a pattern of physical and emotional abuse that only gets worse over time. In fact, the two terms are completely distinct. The term domestic violence refers to any form of physical aggression, including single acts of pushing or grabbing that do not result in injuries. This type of domestic violence is by far the most prevalent. Battering, on the other hand, refers to a pattern of more serious physical assaults that typically, but not always, leads to injury, coupled with a pattern of emotional abuse and controlling and domineering behaviors, such as limiting the partner's access to family and friends, economic abuse, threatening the partner, and so forth. Individuals who are court-ordered to so-called batterer intervention programs do not always fit the profile of a true batterer, and yet they are typically exposed to the same curriculum and the same one-size-fits-all treatment approach. Assumption number 2, while women sometimes abuse men, they typically do so in self-defense or as a means of expressing anger. Research indicates that women assault their intimate partners as frequently as do men, and they do so for essentially the same reasons: in retaliation, to control or punish, to express feelings such as anger, or out of jealousy. The majority of women, and men for that matter, do not assault their partners for purposes of self-defense. Women also perpetrate emotional abuse and controlling behaviors as frequently as men. Men, however, more often engage in physical types of stalking and are far more likely to engage in sexual coercion, including rape. It should also be made clear that female victims are much more at risk than male victims of experiencing serious, life-threatening injuries. Female victims are less able to defend themselves and have very good reason to express higher levels of fear. Still, there is much more symmetry than asymmetry across gender. Abuse is abuse, no matter who is the perpetrator. When female perpetrators are not held accountable for their behavior, they put their victims in danger, become themselves potential targets for retaliation, and, because children are at risk of repeating what they observe, there's an increase in the likelihood that their violence will be carried on into the next generation. According to assumption number 3, the primary cause of domestic violence is patriarchy. That is, social structures and prevailing norms that allow and encourage men to dominate women and to use domestic violence as a means of maintaining male privilege. Attitudes supportive of violence are a risk factor for domestic violence perpetration, but these attitudes are best understood as personality characteristics of particular individuals, rather than social norms per se, as large representative sample surveys find little support for domestic violence perpetration in the general population, and less so for assaults against women compared to men. Some studies have found correlations between the status of women and rates of female domestic violence victimization, especially in underdeveloped countries. But other countries have not found such correlations, and in the United States, studies find that men who believe in strict gender roles are not any more violent than men with egalitarian views. While social factors are more important in some countries than others, research from around the world indicates that domestic violence perpetration is also correlated with other factors, such as having been exposed to abuse or dysfunction in one's family of origin, having an aggressive personality, poor impulse control, being in a high conflict relationship, and the stress of low income and unemployment. With few exceptions, these factors are the same across gender. These findings suggest that improving economic, social, and political opportunities for women will not be sufficient in stopping domestic violence, because domestic violence is essentially a human problem and not strictly one of gender. The overemphasis on patriarchy as a cause of domestic violence has important clinical implications. Emerging research has determined conclusively that perpetrators are significantly less likely to continue their violence when they're able to have a trusting, respectful relationship with their treatment provider, and when they are afforded the kinds of interventions that suit their particular needs. Advising a man who has progressive views on gender relations, but who has poor impulse control and lacks interpersonal communication skills, telling that man that he needs to stop exercising his male privilege, only demonstrates incompetence and risks undermining the relationship. Furthermore, such advice is obviously less than helpful when working with female perpetrators or members of the LGBTQ community. According to assumption number 4, mutual abuse is rare between intimate partners, and treatment approaches that use the couples or family format are inherently unsafe. In fact, the majority of domestic violence is bidirectional or mutual, and women are as likely as men to initiate the violence. Furthermore, there is a high correlation between child abuse and intimate partner abuse. Well-designed outcome studies find couples therapy to be as effective or more so than a traditional group format in cases involving lower levels of abuse, and just as safe. Outcome studies have not yet been conducted on the efficacy of family therapy for domestic violence, But this format has been found to be effective for substance abusers, a population that shares many characteristics with domestic violence perpetrators. And yet, couples and family counseling are forbidden in most states for court-mandated offenders. They are forbidden even though many abusive couples want this type of help and believe that it can help them. The good news is that there is now a growing movement in the United States towards evidence-based intervention. Inspired by the failure of traditional models, as well as the promise of new findings from domestic violence research scholars, an increasing number of policymakers, law enforcement, victim advocates, and treatment providers are looking for ways to more effectively reduce domestic violence in our communities. I offer my online courses as one contribution to this effort. Thank you for listening.